A dignified elderly black woman, respected after a lifetime fighting quietly for justice, was simply trying to return home after a charity event. But the moment she boarded her flight, everything changed. A flight attendant singled her out, subjecting her to humiliating treatment simply because of who she was. But just minutes later, the tables turned dramatically. The flight attendant found herself confronted by the CEO of the airline, who had secretly witnessed everything. What happened next stunned everyone on board, triggering a wave of events nobody anticipated. Stay with me, because this is a story you truly need to hear. Before we begin, please take a moment to comment below and tell us where you're watching from. If this powerful story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day. They say an airport is a city within a city, a sprawling intersection of hopes, dreams, and invisible borders, a place where anonymity both protects and exposes. This particular morning, beneath the sterile lights of Los Angeles International Airport, the air thrummed with an oddly charged quiet, a sense of tension hidden beneath routine courtesy. It was the kind of quiet that older Americans might recognize from years past, a subtle echo of things they'd hoped had faded with time, but which still lingered stubbornly in unspoken glances and slight gestures. In the controlled chaos of Terminal 4 stood Helen Montgomery, elegant and unassuming. She had known many battles and had won most of them quietly, first as a girl growing up in a segregated Georgia town, then as a young woman stepping into classrooms where she was told, without words, that she belonged elsewhere. Now at 68, after decades spent working as a civil rights attorney and quietly raising funds for community scholarships, Helen felt well-earned exhaustion in her bones. She had traveled to Los Angeles for a gala honoring her life's work, though recognition was never her aim. It was the cause that mattered, the quiet work behind the scenes, empowering the unseen. Helen approached the Avalon Sky Airlines counter, her modest suitcase in tow. At the counter stood Christine Holloway, a young woman of impeccable grooming and careful manners. Christine was known among her coworkers as fiercely efficient, though beneath her carefully managed professionalism lurked something sharper, something less kind. "Good morning," Helen greeted softly, placing her boarding pass on the counter. Christine scanned her quickly, noting the simple yet elegant coat, the small suitcase, and the tired yet dignified posture. Helen had not dressed to impress, simply to travel comfortably and unobtrusively. "Morning," Christine responded without warmth, eyes lingering just a moment too long as if categorizing Helen, placing her in some quietly restrictive box. It was a silent, familiar judgment Helen had felt many times over the decades, though rarely voiced outright in these later years. "Seat 4A, business class," Christine said, handing back the boarding pass with restrained skepticism in her voice, a tone Helen immediately recognized. It carried a question never spoken directly. "How can someone like you sit there?" Helen took the pass without comment, thanking her politely despite the subtle weight in her heart. Her life had taught her patience and endurance, and she refused to surrender her peace to fleeting prejudices. Yet even as she moved away, the quiet storm of discomfort had already stirred, the tension following her through security, toward the boarding gate, building step by subtle step. Helen stood at the gate, noting again how the flight attendant, Christine once more, smiled generously at the white passengers, sharing small jokes and offering them assistance without prompting. Yet when Helen's turn came, Christine's eyes hardened imperceptibly, offering only curt instructions and limited patience. Taking her seat aboard Flight AS-315 to New York, Helen felt the rising hum of engines beneath her feet, mirroring the quiet storm in her chest. She looked around, silently observing the other passengers settling into their seats, their faces weary, indifferent, absorbed in their own worlds, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding around them. She wondered if they saw it, the small indignities, the quiet dismissals happening just beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Helen knew these subtle cruelties intimately, had watched them shift over decades from overt hatred into whispered assumptions and concealed contempt. As the airplane taxied to the runway, Helen adjusted her seatbelt, closing her eyes briefly as the plane lifted smoothly into the clouds. She thought of the battles she'd already fought, believing each victory was permanent, each advancement unshakable. Yet now, soaring high above familiar earth, she felt it once again, that quiet resistance, as persistent as the sky itself, reminding her that the struggle for dignity and recognition was still quietly raging, ever present beneath the veneer of civility. Helen opened her eyes as the seatbelt sign blinked off, noticing Christine making her way down the aisle, the cold edge of her professionalism cutting like a blade through the cabin's artificial calm. Helen took a slow, steadying breath, preparing herself quietly for whatever unseen trials lay ahead. Helen Montgomery settled deeper into the broad leather seat, the soft hum of the plane lulling her briefly into comfort. At 68, rest had become more precious than gold, more elusive than memory itself. Yet peace was difficult to grasp, slipping through her fingers like sand, especially in moments like these, moments that should have felt ordinary but instead pulsed with hidden tensions. She opened her eyes slowly, noticing the gentle rhythm of flight attendants moving up and down the aisle, serving beverages and offering polite smiles, carefully curated smiles that concealed truths Helen had learned to read years before. Among them was Christine, whose carefully poised facade remained intact until she reached Helen's row. "Can I get you something?" Christine asked stiffly, her tone veiled with a subtle irritation she reserved, Helen noticed, only for passengers who looked like herself. "A cup of tea, please," Helen answered softly. Knowing her voice revealed nothing of the storm she felt gathering beneath her composed exterior. Christine nodded sharply, disappearing without another word, her abruptness like a quiet slap, a small gesture echoing old wounds. Helen allowed her gaze to drift around the cabin. Across the aisle sat a man roughly her own age, whose eyes briefly caught hers in quiet acknowledgement. It was an understanding born of shared history, of unspoken endurance, a knowing look exchanged countless times through bus windows, across cafe counters, in waiting rooms and boardrooms alike. They had both known the weight of unspoken assumptions, the persistent whispers of inferiority that haunted even the quietest moments. Christine returned minutes later, placing the cup down with unnecessary force, causing the hot tea to slosh dangerously close to the rim. She mumbled no apology, her silence louder than any spoken word. Helen steadied her hand, careful to avoid spilling, calm but acutely aware of passengers quietly turning their gazes away, unwilling to witness this silent injustice or perhaps too accustomed to its occurrence. She remembered vividly those early days of activism, marching in streets alive with fury and hope. She had believed fiercely then in the promise of America's future, a future that would heal its old wounds. But here, decades later, she found herself confronting the persistent shadow of prejudice, a shadow that had shifted forms but never vanished. Across from her, the older gentleman, whom she'd silently named Ernest in her mind, watched the scene with quiet disapproval but said nothing, lips tightened in weary resignation. Perhaps, Helen thought, he'd been taught as she had. That dignity meant enduring quietly, holding back the tide of hurt with grace. But grace, she knew, was often confused with silence, and silence had too long allowed this quiet prejudice to thrive. Halfway through the flight, Helen rose slowly to stretch her legs, carefully moving toward the aisle. She noticed Christine abruptly pause her cart, forcing Helen to maneuver awkwardly around it. Christine's posture radiated annoyance as she muttered softly to her fellow attendant, barely audible but unmistakable. "They always think the rules don't apply to them." Helen froze, feeling a slow, burning anger rise from deep within, an anger she'd managed to quiet over decades. The words felt eerily familiar, reminiscent of countless judgments hurled quietly from the sidelines of her life. She felt eyes upon her, other passengers now watching, though none intervened. The cabin's polite facade had cracked momentarily, revealing the painful truths beneath. Returning carefully to her seat, Helen saw Ernest give a slight, solemn nod, an acknowledgement not only of her strength, but also of their shared burden. Helen's heart ached quietly, knowing this subtle cruelty was neither isolated nor accidental, but deeply woven into the fabric of daily interactions. Sipping her now cool tea, Helen steadied her breathing, reminding herself that strength was not merely endurance, but the quiet courage to confront what others chose to ignore. Today, on this flight high above America's divided landscape, she felt more certain than ever that quiet acceptance was no longer enough. The storm beneath her skin was gathering, and Helen knew she would soon have to face it head-on. It is often said, particularly by those of us who've walked through more sunsets than we have sunrises ahead, that time alone heals the wounds of the past. Yet anyone who's truly lived, who's carried the heavy burden of color in a land that professes freedom but practices selective blindness, knows that time heals nothing on its own. Wounds ignored only fester beneath the polished veneer of civility, erupting in moments that seem small, yet weigh heavy with historical contempt. Helen sat quietly in her seat, her mind restless, burdened with the small humiliations she'd endured over the past hour. Her gaze, steady but troubled, drifted to the window, the patchwork of fields and towns below indifferent to her struggle. A voice crackled over the intercom, announcing mild turbulence, advising passengers to remain seated. It felt to Helen a fitting metaphor for her own life, always navigating turbulent spaces, forced into caution by invisible, yet very real, boundaries. As the plane gently shook, she noticed Christine move briskly through the aisle once again, assisting some passengers warmly while brusquely ignoring others. Helen felt that old, familiar tightening in her chest. She wondered, not for the first time, if the young attendant realized her own prejudice, if Christine even understood the quiet violence in her small gestures. Ernest, across the aisle, suddenly cleared his throat, looking toward Christine with a politely raised hand. Helen watched him closely, recognizing in his careful posture the well-practiced caution of one accustomed to confronting prejudice with civility rather than anger. "Excuse me, miss," Ernest said softly, his voice deep yet mild. "May I trouble you for some water?" Christine's reaction was swift, a brief flicker of irritation crossing her polished features before she masked it. "I'll be with you in a minute," she replied curtly, barely hiding her annoyance. Ernest nodded quietly, settling back with the patience Helen knew too intimately. It was the patience born of necessity, honed over years of enduring subtle indignities. Minutes passed, stretching uncomfortably, while Christine pointedly served others, bypassing Ernest repeatedly. Helen watched closely, her anger building quietly with each passing moment, compounded by memories of a lifetime of similar neglect. Ernest, dignified and patient, said nothing further, eyes forward, face stoically resigned. Finally, as Christine moved past him yet again, Helen gently raised her voice, steady but firm. "Excuse me, miss, I believe this gentleman asked for water quite some time ago." A hush fell over the immediate rows, passengers suddenly attentive to the quiet drama unfolding among them. Christine turned sharply, clearly irritated, eyes narrowing slightly as she fixed them on Helen. "I said I would get to him," Christine replied coldly, her voice louder now, subtly challenging. Helen maintained her composure, the quiet strength she'd cultivated over decades of struggle rising clearly in her voice. "Respectfully, miss, he's been waiting quite patiently, and it seems he's been overlooked several times." Christine's jaw tightened, a brief flash of anger betraying her otherwise disciplined expression. "I assure you, ma'am, no one here is being overlooked," she said defensively, emphasizing the word ma'am, as if it might wound. Ernest intervened quietly, his voice even and calm. "It's all right, ma'am," he addressed Helen gently, though his words resonated clearly for all to hear. "We're used to waiting, aren't we?" The painful truth hung heavily in the air, passengers shifting uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others clearly troubled yet unwilling to speak. Christine, momentarily startled into silence, turned abruptly and moved away, returning swiftly to thrust a cup of water toward Ernest without a word, avoiding eye contact. Ernest accepted it gracefully, offering Christine a quiet "thank you," though she had already turned her back. Helen sat silently, heart heavy, yet grateful for Ernest's gentle dignity. They exchanged a brief, quiet glance, an understanding passing silently between them, a recognition of the countless, unspoken thresholds they had crossed, barriers invisible to others yet painfully real to them. Looking once again out at the vast expanse below, Helen reflected deeply. The turbulence of flight, she knew, would pass, yet the turbulence of human hearts lingered stubbornly, unresolved. How much longer, she wondered quietly, must the dignity of the oppressed rely solely on their patience and grace? How long until the silent complicity of bystanders would transform into genuine understanding and change? In the quiet solitude of the flight, she felt a new resolve stirring within her, a quiet rebellion against the acceptance of prejudice as ordinary. And as she leaned back in her seat, eyes closed but spirit fiercely awake, Helen knew that silent dignity alone was no longer enough. The struggle ahead would require something far greater, courage not just from the oppressed, but from all who claim to believe in justice. There is a special burden carried by those of us who've seen more decades pass than remain ahead, a weight heavy with memories of whispered injustices, quiet slights, and unspoken truths. For Helen Montgomery, who had lived through marches and courtrooms, church basements and city halls, each slight was a brick in the wall separating dignity from despair. Now, aboard this plane slicing through skies that belonged to no one yet were claimed by many, Helen knew the small humiliations were rising towards something she could no longer ignore. She had felt it simmering throughout the flight, the tension between courtesy and contempt, kindness and cruelty. A tension so subtle it often went unnoticed, except by those who'd learned to see beyond polite masks. Helen rested her eyes for a brief moment, but rest did not come. Instead, images returned unbidden. Ernest's patient face as he quietly endured neglect, Christine's pointed gaze filled with unspoken prejudice, the indifferent silence of passengers witnessing injustice but choosing blindness. These quiet scenes reflected America herself, a nation caught between who she claimed to be and who she had always been. Suddenly, Helen's reverie shattered as Christine's voice rose sharply several rows behind. Helen turned slightly to witness an elderly black woman, frail and soft-spoken, holding a broken headset. The woman was explaining gently, "It doesn't work, dear, may I have another?" Christine, voice tight with irritation, replied loudly enough for others to hear, "This isn't a hotel, ma'am. We can't accommodate every small inconvenience." The woman's face fell into quiet embarrassment, her frail hands retreating nervously, shoulders hunched as though apologizing for her existence. Helen felt an ache in her chest, sharp and familiar, like a reopening of wounds long scarred, but never fully healed. She watched Ernest's jaw tighten, yet he remained silent, eyes clouded with a quiet sadness. Around them, other passengers stirred uneasily, uncomfortable witnesses unwilling to confront the ugliness now openly displayed. Helen stood slowly, carefully, dignity radiating from her posture. "Miss," she called clearly, drawing Christine's startled gaze, "there's surely a better way to handle this." Christine, face flushed with sudden anger and embarrassment at being publicly challenged, shot back, voice etched with quiet venom, "Please sit down, ma'am. This doesn't concern you." Helen felt the stares now focused upon her, a mixture of discomfort, curiosity, and judgment from passengers who had previously chosen silence. Their discomfort amplified her resolve. Respectfully, Helen continued firmly, unyielding. It concerns all of us when kindness is dismissed and disrespect becomes normal. Christine's eyes narrowed sharply, her polished facade cracking beneath the weight of Helen's calm confrontation. "I'm simply doing my job," Christine snapped defensively. "Perhaps," Helen replied softly, "but the manner in which you do your job reveals much more than you realize." An uncomfortable silence filled the cabin, the low hum of the engines suddenly oppressive. Christine, lips pressed into a thin line, turned sharply and moved to the front of the plane, abandoning the elderly passenger's simple request unresolved. Helen gently took her seat again, her hands steady despite her pounding heart. Beside her, Ernest leaned slightly across the aisle, whispering quietly, "Thank you, sister." She met his gaze briefly, recognizing gratitude tempered with sorrow, the mutual sorrow of knowing that such confrontations remained necessary, even now, after lifetimes spent fighting invisible chains. Helen turned to the window, eyes glistening but dry, staring into clouds heavy with the unspoken stories of countless others who had endured similar slights. It was not the harshness of overt hatred that wore one down, she thought, but the constant drip of quiet humiliations, the subtle whispers that one does not belong, each encounter another link forged in invisible chains binding dignity and freedom. As the plane began its slow descent through gathering twilight toward New York, Helen understood that confronting Christine was just one step in an endless journey, a journey demanding courage not just from those who suffered prejudice, but from all who observed silently. She knew now, more clearly than ever, that America's greatest challenge lay not only in dismantling visible barriers, but in confronting the invisible prejudices that linger stubbornly in hearts and minds. And so, as wheels touched gently to earth, Helen silently vowed that her quiet patience had reached its limit. She would speak louder, stand taller, and insist more firmly that justice, true justice, required the courage to confront not just the obvious evil, but the quiet complicity of everyday silence. There is an old truth known intimately by those of us who've lived long enough to see history repeat itself, the truth that silence is never neutral. It is complicity dressed in the comfort of quiet, a shield that permits injustice to flourish unseen and unheard. Helen Montgomery knew this silence well. She had spent her youth defying it, her adulthood battling it, and now, in the autumn of her life, she felt its oppressive weight pressing upon her once more. The airplane taxied slowly along the runway at JFK, the muted sounds of buckles clicking and bags shifting filling the air. Christine stood stiffly near the front cabin, her face set in an expression of cold professionalism that no longer masked her simmering resentment. Around her, passengers rose, retrieving belongings, preparing to disembark. Helen remained seated, gathering her strength quietly, determined to carry dignity from this plane despite the quiet indignities it had forced upon her. Yet, as she stood to reach for her small suitcase, she heard Christine's voice, suddenly loud and sharp, directed at Ernest, who had accidentally jostled another passenger's bag. "Please, sir," Christine snapped, her voice edged with undisguised contempt, "if you can't manage your luggage, perhaps you should travel lighter or in a different section." Helen froze, her hand resting atop her suitcase, the quiet cruelty of Christine's remark echoing painfully. Ernest straightened slowly, his posture heavy with a lifetime of similar insults endured silently. Passengers nearby paused, their faces uncertain, eyes shifting uncomfortably. "Different section?" Ernest repeated softly, his voice carrying a quiet dignity that resonated deeply among those listening closely. "And which section might you suggest?" Christine hesitated, suddenly aware of the scrutiny she had invited. But pride hardened her stance, her voice coldly defiant, "One more suited to your needs." Helen felt a fierce heat rise within her, a wave of anger tempered by decades of practiced restraint. Yet restraint, she realized now, had limits, and this moment, this subtle yet glaring insult, had crossed that boundary irrevocably. "Excuse me," Helen interjected clearly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade of truth. "Exactly what needs are you referring to?" Christine turned abruptly, eyes flashing defensively, startled by Helen's challenge. "Ma'am, this is between—" "No," Helen interrupted gently, firmly. "This involves everyone here. Every passenger who remains silent in the face of injustice participates in it. Now, please clarify exactly what you meant." Passengers watched, silent and tense, forced now to confront openly what they had preferred to ignore. Christine's face flushed deeply, her carefully constructed facade crumbling visibly. "I meant no offense," she stammered, suddenly uncertain, her voice softer, yet still tinged with resentment. Helen stepped forward slowly, her posture upright, eyes steady. Yet offense was given, clearly, deliberately. "Words matter deeply, Mississippi. They have histories and meanings beyond your immediate discomfort. We all know what you meant." Christine faltered visibly, glancing around for support, finding instead only eyes turned away in shame or fixed sternly upon her in quiet judgment. Ernest spoke quietly, addressing Helen yet audible to all. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice calm yet resolute. "Some wounds only heal when they are seen clearly." Helen met his gaze, recognizing a profound strength in his quiet courage. Then, turning to the surrounding passengers, she spoke firmly but gently, her voice resonating clearly. "We have all lived long enough to recognize these silent injustices. Perhaps it's time we stopped tolerating them simply because confronting them feels uncomfortable." The cabin remained silent, but the quality of that silence had changed, a shift from passive complicity to reflective acknowledgement. Passengers began moving again slowly, thoughtfully, gathering their belongings, stepping into the aisle quietly, with eyes averted but minds clearly troubled. Christine, now visibly shaken, retreated quietly to the galley, her silence speaking volumes. Helen carefully took her suitcase, stepping into the aisle with Ernest just behind her, their quiet solidarity a powerful statement to all around them. As they walked together slowly toward the airplane door, Helen reflected deeply, understanding anew the exhausting yet necessary truth. Injustice thrives most powerfully in silence, in moments when good people choose comfort over courage. She knew their confrontation today had cracked that silence just slightly, but perhaps enough to let in light, enough to remind everyone present that silence, no matter how familiar, was no longer acceptable. Stepping from the plane into the terminal, Helen felt the cool air against her face, a quiet determination now guiding her steps. The path ahead remained uncertain, yet one thing was abundantly clear: the silence had finally been broken, and the echoes of their courage would continue to reverberate, calling others to confront what had been quietly tolerated for far too long. It has often been my experience, and surely yours, too, if you've lived as long as we have, that injustice does not thrive solely because of those who perpetuate it openly, but rather because of the quiet covenant among decent people to look the other way. Silence, we know, carries a terrible complicity. It shelters prejudice and makes comfortable those who, deep down, sense that something is wrong but fear the disruption that truth demands. Helen felt this truth keenly as she stepped into the bustling terminal at JFK. Beside her walked Ernest, a man whose quiet dignity mirrored her own, their footsteps now synchronized by mutual understanding. They exchanged few words, but silence between them spoke volumes, carrying the weight of shared battles and the weary recognition that those battles seemed endless, though fought anew each day. Ahead of them, Christine stood near the gate, shoulders rigid, eyes carefully avoiding theirs. Her silence, too, spoke volumes, a bitter mixture of shame and defiance. Helen watched Christine momentarily, understanding clearly that this young woman had become a symbol of something much larger, a system and a society conditioned to accept inequality, disguised by polite smiles and professional courtesy. "Thank you," Ernest said softly, breaking Helen's contemplation. His voice was gentle, weighted with quiet gratitude. "It's rare for someone to speak up these days." Helen nodded slowly, sighing with quiet weariness. "And yet we must. Every silence we accept today creates another barrier for tomorrow." As they moved slowly through the crowded terminal, Helen sensed subtle shifts in the people around them. There were sympathetic glances, yes, but there were also wary looks, as if the confrontation aboard the flight had marked Helen and Ernest as disruptors, as people who insisted inconveniently on the discomfort of truth. They had dared to challenge what had been silently accepted as normal. Helen knew the price of breaking silence well. It was never easy, never welcomed. She had paid this price before, in southern streets, northern classrooms, quiet courtrooms filled with tension thick enough to taste. Now here again, decades later, in the familiar bustle of an airport, she faced that old, recurring price once more. At baggage claim, the tension intensified subtly but palpably. Helen noticed several passengers from the flight whispering among themselves, eyes darting briefly toward her, expressions clouded with discomfort or embarrassment. Christine, retrieving her bag, refused even a glance in their direction, yet her silence shouted loudly the anger and resentment she still carried. Then, as Helen quietly gathered her belongings, an elderly white man approached, tentative yet determined. He wore a neatly pressed coat, carried himself upright despite the slight tremor in his step. He too had weathered many storms. "Hi, I heard what happened on the plane," he began softly, awkwardly, his eyes meeting Helen's briefly before glancing downward. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Helen regarded him gently, sensing genuine sincerity behind his hesitation. But something deeper needed addressing, something more than apologies for a single moment. "I appreciate your words," Helen replied softly, calmly, her voice steady but resolute. "Yet I wonder, will you speak up next time, when injustice is happening right beside you?" He met her gaze then, startled but thoughtful, nodding slowly. I should have done more." Ernest stepped closer, his voice low but clear. "We all should have done more. That's the cost of silence, it traps us in complicity." Around them, several passengers listened discreetly, clearly uncomfortable but unable to turn away. Christine, still close enough to overhear, stiffened visibly, the truth of Ernest's words striking a painful chord. Helen spoke again, her voice calm yet firm, directed softly toward the small audience gathered unintentionally around her. "We've spent decades believing things had changed, believing that small indignities no longer matter. But every silence matters. Every quiet acceptance matters. It shapes the world our grandchildren inherit." The elderly gentleman nodded again, shaken yet visibly moved. "You're right. Silence, our silence, is why it continues." Christine suddenly moved past them, luggage in hand, eyes downcast, refusing to acknowledge anyone around her. Helen watched her go, understanding that Christine's silence was another painful acknowledgement of truth, a truth perhaps still too raw, too uncomfortable to fully confront. Helen turned back to Ernest and the elderly stranger, feeling the weight of years pressing upon her yet buoyed by the small step taken today. She knew breaking silence was not a single act but a lifelong commitment, a quiet rebellion against the complacency that allowed prejudice to endure. Outside, the twilight deepened, casting soft shadows across weary faces. Helen drew a slow, steady breath, steeling herself for the battles yet to come. She had learned, long ago, that the fight against injustice was not won in single dramatic moments, but rather in quiet acts of persistent courage, repeated daily, steadily chipping away at the silence that made prejudice comfortable. As she stepped into the waiting car, exchanging final, quiet nods with Ernest, Helen felt a new resolve strengthening within her. She knew that her voice, though quiet and often weary, must never again allow silence to prevail, for silence, more than anything, remained injustice's greatest ally. There is a moment in the life of every person who has carried the heavy burden of America's unresolved contradictions, a moment when the quiet frustrations of a lifetime gather into a storm that refuses to remain hidden. It is not anger alone that fuels the storm, nor mere exhaustion, but rather the profound realization that silence itself has become intolerable. For Helen Montgomery, this moment had arrived with unmistakable clarity. Evening settled quietly over New York City, painting the skyline in muted tones of fading amber and smoky violet. Helen moved through the familiar streets slowly, each step deliberate, each breath steady, but her heart carried the restless rhythm of quiet revolution. The events aboard that airplane lingered heavily in her thoughts, not because they were unique, no, she knew they were painfully ordinary, but precisely because of their terrible familiarity. She entered her apartment, gently closing the door behind her, enveloped by comforting silence. On her kitchen table lay a small stack of mail, atop it a handwritten note from her granddaughter, whose hopeful words described dreams of college and a world she believed would embrace her freely. Helen sighed deeply, knowing too well the quiet disappointments and hidden barriers that awaited even the most hopeful spirits. She set the note down gently, eyes drifting to a photograph on the mantel, her younger self, standing tall at a podium decades before, voice ringing clearly through a crowded hall, demanding recognition not just for herself, but for all who had been forced into quiet submission. Helen remembered vividly how her words had pierced the silence then, how the world seemed briefly poised for change. Yet here she stood, decades later, fighting the same quiet battles, enduring the same subtle humiliations. Suddenly, a quiet knock at her door broke through her reflections. Helen opened it carefully, surprised to find Ernest standing there, holding his hat respectfully. His eyes met hers quietly, carrying profound understanding. "I hope I'm not intruding," Ernest began softly. "But I felt I needed to speak with you." Helen smiled gently, inviting him inside. "You're not intruding. We share something too important for intrusion." He entered slowly, removing his coat carefully, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table. For a moment, quiet filled the room comfortably, two souls acknowledging the quiet camaraderie forged by shared wounds. "I've been thinking about today," Ernest said softly, "and about how often we've accepted these small humiliations as simply the price we pay for living." Helen nodded slowly, eyes reflecting a deep, quiet pain. "It's always been easier, hasn't it, to endure quietly, to pretend dignity lies in silent acceptance?" "Yes," Ernest replied, voice quiet yet firm. "And yet, I wonder, haven't we sacrificed enough for that false dignity?" Helen's eyes flashed briefly with an intensity born of long-held frustration. "We have indeed. Our silence makes it easier for others to remain blind, makes prejudice comfortable, invisible." Ernest leaned forward slightly, voice carrying quiet urgency. "Then perhaps the time has finally come, not just to speak out once, but to continue speaking until silence becomes impossible for everyone." Helen met his gaze steadily, feeling within herself the stirring of courage she had known in her youth. It was true, her voice, their voices, had been quiet too long. America's hidden prejudice thrived precisely because its victims had been conditioned towards silent endurance, quietly protecting those who chose ignorance over justice. Ernest continued softly, "What happened today wasn't extraordinary, but our response was. We disrupted the silence. We must continue. Our voices, quiet alone, can become powerful together." Helen felt the truth of his words resonate deeply within her heart. She glanced again toward her granddaughter's hopeful letter, recognizing clearly now the responsibility they carried, not merely to endure silently, but to speak loudly enough that their grandchildren might inherit a different world. "You're right," Helen finally whispered, her voice steady yet filled with quiet resolve. "It's time we break this silence not just once, but continuously, until it becomes unignorable." Together they sat, quietly absorbing the magnitude of their decision. It was not easy, this quiet reckoning, for it demanded from them the relentless courage to challenge the polite fiction that America's deepest wounds had already healed. As Ernest stood to leave, Helen felt the weight of history pressing urgently upon them both. Yet alongside this heaviness was something else, a quiet sense of liberation, born from acknowledging openly what had long remained hidden beneath quiet civility. "Thank you," Helen said softly as Ernest moved toward the door. "Thank you for reminding me that courage grows stronger when shared." Ernest smiled gently, his quiet dignity radiating warmth. "It's never too late for courage," he replied softly. "And perhaps now, more than ever, America needs our voices." The door closed softly behind him, leaving Helen alone once more, yet no longer isolated. She stood quietly, gazing again at the photograph on the mantel, the image of herself decades earlier, voice raised boldly against injustice. She understood now, deeply and completely, that the past and present were bound together not just by quiet wounds, but by quiet courage as well. And it was this courage, quiet, persistent, unyielding, that would guide her through whatever trials still lay ahead. Outside, twilight had given way to night, stars emerging quietly above a city poised between history and hope. Helen knew clearly now, the silence had been broken, and the echo of their courage would soon become impossible to ignore. If there is one truth that a lifetime teaches with painful clarity, it is that change rarely arrives as a dramatic revelation or a swift decree. Rather, it comes quietly, persistently, carved slowly from the hardened stone of indifference by hands tired yet determined. Helen Montgomery had lived this truth, had felt it in every step taken, every quiet struggle faced, every dignified silence endured. And now, at last, she understood fully that silence alone would never birth the America she dreamed of for her grandchildren. Days passed quietly after the incident aboard the plane, but something significant had shifted within Helen. The small indignities she'd accepted as inevitable now stood starkly in her memory, no longer isolated incidents, but interconnected symptoms of a deeper illness, America's persistent, hidden prejudice. Helen found herself restless, sleepless at times, haunted by the realization that silence could no longer shield her nor heal the wounds quietly festering in the nation's heart. Early one crisp morning, as sunlight filtered softly through her kitchen window, a letter arrived. It bore the logo of Avalon Sky Airlines, its envelope thick and official. Inside was an apology, carefully worded, polite yet cautiously distant, and an invitation. The airline was conducting internal training to address recent concerns. They had invited Helen, they wrote, to speak candidly to their employees, to offer her voice as part of their journey toward greater understanding. Helen sat quietly at her table, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Her first instinct was hesitation. She had spoken before many crowds, faced many difficult rooms filled with skepticism and subtle resistance. Yet now, at 68, the task felt heavier, more daunting, demanding not just strength, but faith that America still retained capacity for genuine reflection and change. She remembered Ernest's quiet words clearly, his gentle urging that their voices were needed now more than ever. Closing her eyes briefly, Helen felt the weight of history, the echo of all those who had endured silently before her, whose voices had been silenced or ignored. She understood then that this invitation was not merely for her, but for them, for all who had waited too long for acknowledgement and justice. With quiet determination, Helen began preparing her words, crafting them gently yet unflinchingly. When the day arrived, she entered the modest auditorium at the airline's headquarters, filled with employees of all ages and backgrounds, their faces mixed with curiosity, discomfort, and tentative openness. She stepped quietly to the podium, feeling every eye upon her, sensing clearly the quiet resistance hidden beneath polite expressions. Drawing a slow, steady breath, Helen began softly, voice resonating with quiet strength. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for this invitation. Today, we gather not merely to address a single incident, but to confront a truth long avoided, that our silence, our quiet complicity, allows prejudice to flourish." The room shifted uncomfortably, tension rippling quietly through rows of attentive faces. Helen continued, calmly yet resolutely. "The challenges we face today are not new. Many here, like myself, have lived long enough to remember times we believed had passed. Yet subtle prejudices endure quietly beneath the surface of daily life, protected by the comfortable silence we offer them." She paused, eyes meeting briefly those of Christine, seated near the back, her expression carefully guarded yet attentive. "I do not stand here today in anger or accusation, but rather in hope that breaking our silence might finally begin healing wounds quietly carried by generations. Each of us must decide whether to confront the prejudice within ourselves and around us or remain comfortably blind." She spoke steadily, recounting quietly yet powerfully her own experiences aboard their airplane, moments Christine and others had perhaps forgotten, unaware how deeply such small actions wounded. As Helen finished, the room remained quiet briefly before applause, tentative at first, then stronger, rising gradually into genuine acknowledgement. Christine sat quietly, visibly moved, eyes glistening with something like shame tempered by reflection. Afterwards, as Helen stepped slowly from the podium, Christine approached quietly, eyes lowered respectfully. "Ms. Montgomery," she began softly, voice trembling slightly, "I want to apologize sincerely for what happened. I hadn't realized." Helen gently raised her hand, voice calm yet firm. "Thank you for your apology. But true apology means committing yourself to change, to confronting honestly what lies quietly beneath your actions." Christine nodded slowly, clearly struggling yet earnest. "I understand that now. I promise I will." Helen offered her hand gently, the brief touch signaling a quiet yet powerful reconciliation, not merely personal but symbolic, representing hope for a broader, deeper awakening. Leaving the auditorium, Helen felt a quiet exhaustion mixed with quiet triumph. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but today marked a step, one small yet meaningful step toward breaking America's quiet covenant with prejudice. Outside, the city hummed softly beneath clear skies. Ernest stood waiting quietly, offering her a gentle smile, eyes reflecting quiet pride and gratitude. "You spoke beautifully," he said softly. Today, silence lost some of its power. Helen smiled, feeling deeply the quiet truth of his words. Together they stood a moment, understanding fully that their task, America's task, remained ongoing, yet hopeful now that courage had broken through silence, allowing quiet dignity finally to become powerful action. As they walked slowly through the sunlit streets, Helen felt a quiet peace settling within her, a peace born not from passive acceptance, but active confrontation, courageously facing America's most persistent contradictions. She knew now, clearly and irrevocably, that silence had been broken at last, replaced by quiet voices rising together, voices older yet wiser, gentle yet unyielding, speaking truth into the quiet places America preferred to ignore. And within this quiet chorus lay the promise of genuine change, a dawn breaking quietly yet unmistakably through the long American night.